Hi, and welcome everybody. My name is Paul Roberts, and welcome to our afternoon session. This is a panel discussion, Corporate Espionage and Insider Threat, Monitoring Behavior, Valuing Data, Quantifying Risk, and Assigning Accountability. And I thank you all for coming here this afternoon. I am a longtime security reporter. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Security Ledger, and I'm a contributing writer at Christian Science Monitor Passcode. I've been covering the security space for around 13 years. And the topic of this panel discussion, I think, is incredibly relevant, just kind of looking with that perspective. I think depending on how you define the term insider, it's not something we're going to talk about today, you can find evidence of insider threats behind almost every major data breach or cybersecurity story or incident that's in the headlines that you're reading about in the papers and online. Obviously, we can all think of Target stores, which was compromised by way of a third-party contractor, an HVAC contractor who was servicing the buildings that Target occupied. We can think about Anthem security, where a compromised administrator account was used to move laterally within Anthem's network and ultimately steal or exfiltrate data from that organization on affecting millions of Americans who received their health care through Anthem. And of course, more locally, we can talk about OPM, where breaches at two separate contractors who had worked with OPM ultimately were preceded and contributed to the compromise of the OPM network as well. That, as you know, as everybody in this room knows, affected around 18 million government employees and their family members. So insiders can come up in many forms, from disgruntled or rogue employees to compromised or hacked employees, compromised businesses, supply chain partners, third-party contractors, and so on. But if those threats are well known, why are companies not doing a better job? Well, companies and public sector organizations, individuals not doing a better job identifying and thwarting these attacks. One reason is that understanding the phenomena of insider threats and attacks and preventing them are two very different things. Our session today is going to talk a little bit about the former, which is identifying insider threats, what are insider threats, understanding them, and more on, with the goal of making this a useful session for everybody, on identifying them, preventing them, blocking and thwarting cyber espionage, insider threats, and so on. So I've got a great panel set up to talk about that, and let me just introduce them. Starting to my right, your left, we have, and I'll let them introduce themselves, Leo Scanlon, who is Acting Director of Information Assurance and Security at the Department of Health and Human Services. Leo, welcome.
Thank you.
You can, yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so it's
your mic, sir.
Pardon me, Acting Division Director at HHS. I'm the CISO responsible for the headquarters operating division at HHS. I've been in the federal government or as a contractor for almost 20 years doing security work, and as a CISO for the last 10 years, and have a great interest in the implementation of the risk management framework and its implication for managing large data stores.
Thank you. And to Leo's left, we have Gautam Agarwal, who's the Chief Marketing Officer at Bay Dynamics. Gautam.
Thanks, Paul. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Gautam Agarwal. First name is easy to remember, like Gotham City. So, and I'm the Chief Marketing Officer with Bay Dynamics. I've been in the security industry for the last 15 plus years, working with the likes of FireEye and Cisco. And for us, from a Bay Dynamics standpoint, just to give you a little bit of a background, Bay Dynamics is a cybersecurity company which is helping businesses protect their data using behavioral and predictive analytics. And then our flagship product, Risk Fabric, is helping your businesses to really come back and identify, as what Paul was sharing, in terms of what's happening around those four key vectors. What's happening with your insiders, what's happening with outsiders, coming in on the inside looking like insiders, what's happening with the third-party vendors and contractors. And then finally, last but not the least, who's touching all your critical assets, the one which are holding your crown jewels. Is it an insider or malicious insider? Is it like an outsider touching your assets? Is it like a vendor touching your assets? What are they doing with your assets? So like who's actually touching your assets? and what's really happening with all. So bringing like analyzing, identifying, profiling, and then bringing it back in terms of reporting back to your management team. That's what data analytics does for you. Thank you.
Thanks, Gautam. To my left, Gregg Smith, who's the CEO of OptioLabs.
Thanks, Paul, and it's really nice to be here. As Paul said, Gregg Smith, longtime security entrepreneur in the state of Maryland. And at OptioLabs, we focus both on mobile security and insider threat security. So let me ask a question. How many of you folks have been on an airplane and snooped over somebody's shoulder reading something on somebody's laptop? Come on, let's be honest now, right? Right? Everybody's done that, whether it's the newspaper or something on their computer. One of our products called PrivateEye is really focused on the last 2 feet between someone's eyes and the computer screen. And we have technology that will secure your screen while you're looking at it and fuzz the screen when you're looking away. And if somebody, like the example I used on the airplane, happens to be looking over your shoulder, we'll capture that eavesdropper on your computer screen so you can see who's looking over your shoulder. In the event of, in the enterprise, if somebody is intruding, trying to log onto your computer, we capture a picture as well and send that alert to a SIM tool to see that there's a potential insider threat there. So that's our tech, Paul.
The greatest collection of photo bombs in the entire world. And last but not least, Casey Corcoran is Vice President of Strategy at 4V Systems.
Yeah, hi, and that's pretty creepy, by the way, what you guys do. But I think it's cool. So, yeah, I'm with 4V Systems now. Just previously to this, I was CIO of Joseph A. Bank, and the biggest question the hardest question that I had to answer almost any time would be when the leadership team would ask me is, how secure are we, right? They would say, hey, is everything okay? And I'd go, yeah, it's okay. What do you mean, right? And so that's what we set out to solve at 4V, is taking cyber risk and putting it in business terms, right? Looking at the sensor data, monitoring it 24/7, coming up with a risk profile, and taking that and putting it in terms that you can actually have that conversation with your CFO or the CEO with and say, yeah, our risk index is at X, our normal is Y, we're actually doing better than what we projected we were going to do. Or we're not quite as good as we need to be. Black Friday's coming up. Our profile on Black Fridays looks like this because we've been monitoring this continuously. In order to get to where we want to be, we need to do this and this and this, and it's going to cost that because it's going to protect this, right? So really going into it from a business terms perspective and out of the jargon world.
Okay, great. And I'd like to say that we are going to both leave time for questions at the end of the session, but if you have a question that occurs to you and you want to throw your hands up, I'm not opposed to throwing questions to the audience before that as well. But I'm going to start off with a few questions to get things going. So I think this is a question for, at least for Gautam to start with. So the insider threat pie, as I said, this is insider threats kind of in the headline of this session. It can be divided up into many different pieces. Some of which I outlined. But as you look at it, this is something Bay Dynamics really focuses on. What is the biggest piece there, and what are some of the other pieces in that pie? So insider threat is an umbrella term. To the extent that these people need to understand it, what are the things that they need to understand most about it?
Sure, Paul. I can definitely take a stab at that. So a question for all of you. When we talk about insider threats, what really comes to mind? Like, I would love to hear from the audience, like what really comes to mind? Is it like, yes, sir? The user, the employees, right? So that's definitely, what are they doing? What else comes to mind?
More specifically, the unwitting insider, they get stooped by spear phishing emails.
Exactly, the unintentional insider getting duped by phishing, absolutely. What else comes to mind?
The insider I don't know.
The insider you don't know, exactly. What exactly the insider doing? Well, I really don't know. What the insider you don't even know who's on the inside. What else comes to mind?
IT person.
The IT person, yes, very important. As Paul was talking about the system administrator, right? The IT person really getting breached, that caused the Anthem breach. So the IT person, and the list continues. What else comes to mind? Yes, ma'am.
Your vendors that have access.
Yeah.
Your vendors which have access, absolutely. Yeah. So if you look at the insider profile, it's all of the above. It's exactly what we have seen from a landscape standpoint to say, people I don't know who on the inside, exactly like an outsider impersonating like an insider. I really don't know who it is. It's the unintentional insider who just got scammed by a spear phishing attack. is the insider who's like a regular employee who's trying to do the right thing, but unintentionally violating business policies. Because their peer and the department is doing the same thing, they're doing the same thing, but unintentionally they're violating business policies. To your point, third-party vendors and contractors. We heard that coming in, what happened with Target and OPM and all the breaches. Third-party vendors and contractors getting breached, and then their credentials being used to come on the inside to look like a legitimate insider, right? And then, so I'll just give you an example. So the pie consists of all this stuff. When we are doing real-world customer deployments, we are looking to come back and monitor, like really come back and monitor this entire piece of the pie. Not just one piece of the puzzle to say what employees are doing, but what really your employees are doing. Is it a person on the inside we don't know? Is there a malicious insider, people who are going rogue on me, trying to start their own business, trying to exfiltrate stuff I really don't know? Or do I see like a third-party vendor or contractor who has all the credentials to come on the inside, but now they have been compromised and their credentials are being used on the inside to come back and touch my critical assets? And I think that from a customer standpoint, what we have seen in a real-world deployment, customers in a real-world deployment, they had 90% of the employees who were violating business policies. Look at that pie. Out of that pie, you have 90% of your regular employees who are actually trying to do the right stuff, but they're violating business policies. Out of the majority of the 10%, you have people who are either taking shortcuts, and they're expecting that nobody's really going to find out that they're taking shortcuts, or we have these risky insiders, people who are at a C-level right now, or a power user, or an IT person, who have all the right access in terms of multiple machines, multiple systems, multiple assets, and then they were the ones who are actually putting the business at risk. And it's actually a one person who's a compromised insider, who's a malicious insider or a compromised insider, who's actually doing the wrong stuff. And what we have seen is when you start bringing this pie out to say 90% trying to do the right stuff, business policy violations, majority of the 10% are putting my business at risk, and then I have the 1%, which is actually the malicious insider, it actually becomes the needle in the haystack kind of a problem. How do I really come back and eyeball this stuff to say, can I really come back and analyze, with all the security controls I have, can I really come back and analyze Gotham as a user coming on the inside? Is it really Gotham in the marketing department touching my financial service? Is he trying to do the wrong thing? Or is it Gotham who's been compromised based on what I see on all the security controls that he's been compromised, and now there's somebody who's looking like Gotham trying to do the wrong thing? Or if Gotham just hired a third-party vendor or contractor who's coming on the inside, who's trying to basically do the wrong thing. So I think from a Bay Dynamics standpoint, that's exactly what we're trying to figure out. What's the pie? How can I come back and monitor what's happening with your employee base? What's happening with your vendors and contractors? What's happening with outsiders coming on the insiders? Can I come back and analyze through your data? Your data has all the information. Like, nobody should come back and tell you your data doesn't have the right information. It has all the information. Can I come back and sift through the data, analyze the data, correlate the data, connect the dots for you, bring it all back together, not depending on the security controls, and then come back and provide you the big picture? Can I come back and provide you that picture which can say 1,000 words? So I think that's what is required.
Lee, you have the honor of being kind of the end user on the panel. So tell us your thoughts on this. Does that what Gautam's saying?
Absolutely, all of that.
Okay.
And there's from
All that and more.
All that and more, yeah, because the government, the federal government, as probably many people in the room know, has for several years been under an effort, a large-scale effort, to try to identify insider threat through Executive Order 13587. But more importantly, that effort is really about understanding where our data is. And the biggest problem that we're dealing with, we're sort of relearning a lot of lessons that we've learned over the last 20 years of IT work. A lot of stuff is very, very basic, and it includes identifying your assets, knowing who's got access, knowing why they've got access, knowing and being able to monitor what they're doing. But all of that at a simple signature level, just like with antivirus, doesn't necessarily tell us what we need to know. There's a lot more that we need to understand about patterns of behavior, patterns of activity, and at the same time, we've got a paradox that we're dealing with technologically, I call it, is that it's cheap to store a lot of data and it's expensive to secure a lot of data. But we've got this two contrary things, and because data storage is so cheap, the impulse is for everybody to store everything. And this affects whether you're dealing with FOIA requests, classified information, e-discovery in the legal world. We have a very, very big problem that we've got too much data floating around, uncategorized, unidentified, and the cost of securing all of it is beyond our means. And if we don't figure out how to square these two contrary impulses, we're not going to be able to keep track of, nor will we be able to detect the insider activity, because it's just too broad, too big.
So Casey, I know we talked about this a little bit before the panel, but this is something that you guys pay attention to, which is companies kind of understanding your risk as an organization, where your sensitive IT assets and data lie,
Right.
and then trying to direct your IT security spend and resources towards where it matters. I guess where's the gap there? Why is it so difficult for companies to understand where their critical data is and even identify what their critical IT assets are?
Yeah, where do you start with that, right? So it's hard enough in a large organization to really understand where all of your users are putting your data, right? That's where it starts. And your users, not because they're being malicious, but because they're trying to get the job done, will put their data in places you would never think of, like Dropbox and on thumb drives and personal drives and on their laptops, and they'll take it home. And so really to figure that out is, while you have a formal structure that you can define and say, this is where my credit card data is, this is where my healthcare data is, what we're finding over and over again is that might be a nice theory, but it's just not true. So what can you do, though, is you can look at baselining what is normal behavior inside that network. And sure, there might be a bad actor in the network while you're baselining it, but eventually that bad actor will go do something else which will deviate from that as well. And you can say, okay, I may not know necessarily where all of my data is all of the time, but I do know what the behavior of the people that are accessing that data is within my network. And analytics these days can sift through that kind of data fairly efficiently and come up with profiles. And based on that, come up with deltas, which represents risk. Now, is it a perfect model? It's not a perfect model. No model is perfect. That's why it's a model. However, it's a useful model, which you can then pair up with the other types of analytics that you already have, which is trying to do that detailed correlation to get it down to here's the bad actor, right? So you use the broad modeling to zoom in on the problem, and then the detailed correlation to go find out where the actual problem is.
And I guess this is a question really for the panel, and I'll leave it to whomever wants to throw their hand up in it. Is the problem at a practical level that, kind of as Lee said, there's too much data, there's too much of a willingness within organizations to hold on to data for reasons kind of TBD, right? We'll figure out if you're a company, we'll figure out how to monetize this data. If you're a public service organization, we'll figure out how to extract intelligence from it. Is the problem just that there's too much data and too loose controls over how that data moves within the network? Or is it just a lack of visibility over IT infrastructure in general? So it's not just the data, it's also the applications and it's the user permissions, and we just don't have any control.
I think it's both, right? I mean, you've got BYOD now in the government and also in the enterprise. So you've got mobile devices coming in, you've got tablets, you've got your desktop computers. You don't know where, as Casey said, you don't know where that data is. A lot of it resides on people's laptops. A lot of it resides on people's mobile devices. In the BYOD environment, the enterprise loses complete control over that. So the threat vector of attack is really broad, right? I mean, you can attack the network, you can attack the mobile devices, you can attack the laptops, you can go in through Wi-Fi. And I think, I'm not sure which of the panelists said this, but plenty of money is available for storing your data. But the security to secure that ecosystem that I just described is vast and costs a lot of money. And there's no one vendor yet today that can really solve that problem.
Right. Kind of example from the trenches, I live in Boston, so there was a hospital in Boston that had a pretty significant HIPAA violation, and the scenario was that they had a surgeon who was also teaching at one of the local universities. And what he was doing was taking his cases, his surgical cases from that day and copying them up to Dropbox so that he could make them available to his students as sort of the subject of that. He was doing what seemed like a good thing, like, I'll bring real cases in and talk about what I really did. But of course, that was protected health information. It wasn't, and he was copying it up to a personal Dropbox account. And that ended up kind of resulting in a fine. Yeah.
Okay. Let's take a real case. I want to understand how you will prevent that. You would have prevented it. We know what Snowden did, right? Here's the system
Edward Snowden. Yep.
Had access to a lot of machines. Nobody cared what he accessed, but he was doing it for quite some time. Okay? The question is, what would you have done in hindsight in 2020, that, from each one of our perspective, what you would do, you could have done.
Yeah, so-
To prevent that.
So
Yeah,
our product would have solved that problem right out of the gate. So if Booz Allen and the NSA were using the product at the time, we would have been able to identify by snapping Snowden's picture while he was logging in with different credentials. So we might have not caught him the first day, but we definitely would have caught him the second day.
So he was borrowing credentials from his colleagues, because otherwise, if it had all been linked to his account, first of all, he wouldn't have had the access he needed, and second of all, that would have put up red flags. So they had shared admin credentials that were being passed around, or that he had social engineered.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we don't provide, with our product, we do not provide one picture so you're in, just like you do a single sign-on with your password. We're providing continuous authentication of that laptop over time. So we're taking a view of that user continually to ensure that that user is there.
Okay, where do you store those photos? For example, people like Snowden is so smart, he will delete those photos.
So typically, they can be resided, whether it's on the client itself or at the enterprise in the IT department. And again, we will tie directly into
Let's
LDAP
give other
as well.
people, let's see what other people,
Of destroying his own track.
Why don't we talk about it offline?
yeah.
Okay?
But let's get, I want to give other people a chance to take a swing at Snowden, so, so Lee.
Well, there's, just to sort of be like the government wonk on this thing, you have to begin with policy, right? And if you don't have a policy that clearly identifies how you're going to get separation of duties and what is your purpose in doing that, you won't be able to figure out which of these tools, and my colleagues here have a lot of cool stuff that can help you track that down. But the real question you have to ask is, well, why aren't people doing it? We kind of started with that. Where is it that our commitment to a rigorous approach to this seems to be breaking down? Part of it is money, part of it is cost. The OPM thing, well, you've got all kinds of vendors cross-linking their AD credentials across the network. Well, that's totally stupid, but why do you do it? You do it because you've got a mission, and you've got to get a lot of data moving to this person and that person and over there. So this is a tough fight. I mean, what I want to say is that this is hard. The answer to your question is this is really hard. And what he does and what every insider does is they find these points where the business mission intersects with the policy commitment, and they aim at that point. They're studying it. So our job in part is to really think like that. And then if we can find those points, we can find the tool. If we find our weakness, we can apply the tool. If we don't have the tool, we can ask these guys to develop it. And believe me, you tell them what the problem is, they're going to come up with a solution. But we have to identify the problem.
And yeah,
This one.
so I'll take a stab at that one too. So to your point, Edward Snowden, right? So as a user, he was like a regular user. He did not have any IT credentials or any privileged access credentials. But he was observing what we could say, like, high privilege behavior. Like when Snowden was coming in, as one of my colleagues was saying, he was logging in from multiple machines. He had multiple credentials he had borrowed, like 5 different machines and credentials he had borrowed. And so when Snowden was doing that within the system, somebody should be eyeballing that, okay, as a regular user, he doesn't have access to all these credentials. So why is this particular user now trying to come in through multiple different credentials and trying to show me a privileged behavior or a privileged user access? Then he was trying to access NSA files, which he had no access to. But through that privileged credentials, he had access to those files. Now, Snowden as a regular user has no access to those files, but now through the observed privilege access, which I see, he is now showing me access to those particular files. Why is that happening? Somebody needs to come back and basically not just eyeball the user, but also the entities and the assets they're touching. I think that's a story which really needs to come back together to say, what is the user really going to go after? They're going to go after my personal health information or a PII or my social security or my credit card. Where are those assets stored? And at the same time, who is this user who's trying to come in? Is it like a regular user showing me privilege access, and then how can I bring those pieces back together? I think that's how you can come back and catch the likes of a Snowden or anybody trying to show that kind of a privilege access.
Casey.
I'm not sure that, at the time when that happened, I'm not sure that the controls were in place to actually monitor what needed to be monitored, right? I think that's the failure that we need to learn from. And it's not that the tools aren't out there that can do that. It's that they weren't being employed. And it comes back to the question of why wasn't there the commitment to do that? So I don't think there's any question that these days we could do that kind of monitoring. The question is, are we willing to go through the cost and the sometimes pain of setting up our organization in such a way that that monitoring is effective.
Well, and I mean, to hear Lee talk as well is in some ways the way we are structuring our business and our increasing reliance both on contractors, on third parties, and these days obviously cloud service providers to offload capabilities to host applications for us. Does that complicate this by first of all breaking down that perimeter, and second of all, there are just more cooks in the kitchen?
So I know you're going to get me into this. So one of the things that I said yesterday when we talked about this is that the concept of protecting your perimeter is almost obsolete, right? Because of the fact that we are all now operating in an enterprise of everything, right? The entire internet is really our enterprise because of the fact that all of these devices are connected to our important information, and it's being shared in such a way that you don't know where it is, you don't know where it's going to go. And even though we have a lot of tools that can look at movement within our the networks that we can protect, it may not be where the information is, right? So when you say insider threat, well, if the information is outside, is it still an insider threat? So I think we're asking the wrong question. The question that we need to be asking is, in an enterprise of everything, how do we protect data? Not how do we try to shut the doors on something that we can't even define anymore.
We talk a lot about monitoring data flows and behavior online. I'd interested in, from Greg, kind of how much of this can we really boil down to individuals and the actions and movements of individuals apart from their online, the sort of the trail they're leaving online or on your network, just in spotting suspicious activity by employees, right. In interpersonal relationships or just in their movements around the office.
I keep having to come back to the product and the solution, right? So it's how do I even know that my colleague is really not looking at something that I'm working on that could have an effect on our company? So think about an M&A transaction, and you're in talking to the corporate counsel about a contract, and you're a sales guy, and lo and behold, you see you're divesting a division of the company. That is insider information, right? So there's so many variations of that example I just gave, whether it's the researcher and the analyst in the financial organization and the trader coming in and looking at research that he shouldn't be looking at. So again, for our focus at Optio, it's all about that last 2 feet, right? It's what can somebody else see that's on your computer screen and protecting that. We also have a higher fidelity product for the Intel and DoD market, which scrambles the screen entirely, and it only tracks exactly the words that you're looking at. So again, it's all about the protection of that last 2 feet, but basically anybody can see it. It's out there.
Okay. There are many different data breaches that we've heard about at different organizations. It seems that the fault or the cause of the breach is slightly different in each of them. So is there a, if we were to look across all these incidents, is there sort of a paradigm for how to not have a data breach or how to not be a victim of a malicious insider or a compromised insider? What technologies do you need? What processes do you need in place? Can we distill some wisdom out of the sort of the aggregate of all these incidents?
Huge question. I think one of the failures of the one of the failures of the way that we try to protect things now, we talked about the perimeter, put that aside for a second, is that we try to predefine the rules by which we're going to protect these things, right? When in fact, we know for a fact that the rules that we were going to be breached by are not the ones that we're protecting. So it's not a matter of going out and say, let's try to figure out every single permutation of every data instance that I can find on my network and put a rule in for it. For one thing, if you try to do that, your SIM will come crashing down around you. But for another thing, you can't possibly stay ahead of it. What you really need to do is look at that cloud of data, that exhaust of data that's your critical environment. from a holistic point of view. You need to be looking at that and modeling it and detecting when there are disturbances in the force. And then you can go in and say, hey, let me investigate this disturbance and see where that is coming from. And I think that's how we start getting to, in the absence of being able to secure our data no matter where it is in the world, because we're not there yet. You would need some sort of a blockchain, Bitcoin we talked about yesterday, type environment, which doesn't exist yet in very many places. In the absence of that, what we can do is we can look at the totality of the way the data space is moving and do analytics on that and try to hone in on things that we weren't able to define ahead of time.
Okay. Gautam, you want to take a swing at that?
Yeah, so I think, Paul, back to your point, I think it's a combination of all of the above in terms of you need the technology and the process. And then one of the points which Leo had mentioned that somebody's going to go directly at that process, at that rule which is being defined, and they know exactly what the rules are defined. Rules can tell me basically something which is good or bad. It really doesn't come back and really tell me whether it's something which is normal versus unusual. And I think that's what people are going to go after, to say, I know what the rules are defined. They are very static in nature. I can go back and circumvent those rules because I'm going to come back and show that I'm doing a normal behavior, whereas nobody's been able to catch that unusual pattern. But at the same time, back to the point about process, that you need to basically close the loop. Just having a technology in place which is going to come back and help me identify and detect all this stuff, great, this is all goodness. Can I come back and then drive some kind of awareness, security awareness within the organization? People to have the right training to say, you're an unintentional insider who is doing business policy violation. Can I come back and train you to do the right thing? Or if I have to come back and basically drive another process to say my third-party vendors or contractors are the ones who are putting my business at risk, can I come back and drive some kind of a self-governance with those vendors? Can I come back and hold them accountable to say, here are the vendor groups which you are coming on the inside, and this is what they're doing. Can I hold them accountable to come back and do the right thing? Right? So it's a combination of getting the people trained, holding the self-governance for your vendors, and also the line of business, right? Like enterprises of all kinds, you have your own line of business. How do you really come back and hold people within the business units or within your administration accountable to make sure that people within your departments are doing the right thing, they're touching the asset for all the right reasons, right? So it's a combination of technology and process coming together.
Lee, you guys have probably bought one of everything over the years, and I'm sure you're getting pitched all the time on cyber threat intelligence, right? Data leak protection, everything under the sun. As you look at your situation, do you see it as I need tools that I don't have, or do you see it as I need to make better use of the tools that I do have? I need different people from the ones I have, or more people than?
Well, it's all of that stuff. But the big problem is you can end up with a lot of shelfware, because if you really haven't figured out what your target of protection is, a lot of tools look really good, and then you start to use them, and you find out that the problem is not with the tool. You find out that it becomes shelfware. Why? The problem is not that there's something wrong with the tool, there's something wrong with you. You didn't figure out what you really wanted to do. And then so this is the biggest thing that, in my own watching around and having done it, is the hardest part to deal with, because like Gautam was saying, you need to know, and you need reporting. This is the other thing. The key thing is, from the standpoint of managing this risk, to go back to another point that somebody made, these attacks are going to occur, and they're going to be successful. That's period, end of story. Not even a question about stopping that. The question is, can you detect? Can you prevent lateral propagation? How fast can you prevent that? And can you report? Can you report up to people who need to know, which is the other task, especially for, I assume most of us here are security practitioners. We're not the C-suite people making those decisions. We're the people responsible for presenting the picture so that the right decision gets made. And reporting is very critical. There is a matter, you mentioned skill sets. Very, very big problem. The skill sets are out there. They're hard to acquire. They're very expensive. I was at a meeting once where somebody from the DoD sort of said to a bunch of civilians, said, well, what's your security research unit? And we all laughed and said, we don't have any security research unit. And this guy was very shocked. And then he was talking about a SIM, and we said, we can't even hire a SIM operator because the A, B, and C team is all up at the fort, and we can't afford to pay these guys. So we do have a real issue with how do we get the skill sets in place. And I think that goes back to my first point. It doesn't exist if we're going to have to defend everything. We really need to think about what it is that we need to defend, and we got to scope it, because it is true, there are no boundaries. You can't put a boundary around the internet and the river of data that we're dealing with. So we have to decide what it is, and then we can decide how we're going to do it.
Can I add one thing to that?
No.
Okay. And not only do we have to decide what's important, but we have to understand how effective the tools and the operations we're putting in place actually are. And unless we're measuring before and after, you have no idea, right? The conversation that I have more often than I care to admit was, I need another $100,000 to go put this widget in over here to make us secure. And the answer would be, well, didn't I just give you a widget last month? Yeah, but that was a different widget, right? Well, how secure will it make us? Well, it'll stop, some words. And eventually the CFO would go, well, we won't be secure, I guess, if I don't give that to you. I'm selling my capabilities on fear. And selling on fear is not making us any more secure because, in fact, I was overselling that widget because I needed that widget, but I couldn't tell you, was that going to make me more secure or wasn't that going to make me more secure? I thought it might, and that's as good as it got.
So it gets back to the question of how do you know how much investment to make for a very important topic like insider threat as it relates to your risk threshold? Do companies will know what their risk thresholds are? Do they know what their risk appetite is? And in relation to that, how do you know how much investment to make?
So what I would say is if you're not measuring it, you'll never know. It starts there. You need to know what your risk is so that you can establish a threshold so you can have that conversation. If you're not measuring it, either by going in and mapping out what you have and then saying, hey, this is what that risk represents, and then saying, now let me put a metric to it and let me continuously measure it, then you can have a conversation. If you're not even looking at it, or if you're not creating that piece of data, it's going to be wrong, no question about it, but it's something you can have a conversation about.
What was the number, though, that was reported from insider threat theft? $1 trillion? I mean, if you're a big pharma company and somebody steals your next new cancer drug, is it worth that $100,000? I mean, that's the type of IP we're talking about being stolen in this country.
Which is why the cost of breach calculations are all over the map, right? Because we're equating drug designs or new product design with credit card numbers. One of those is incredibly easily replaced and basically valueless. The other might represent hundreds or millions of dollars worth of investment. So,
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add to your point. When you're trying to basically measure your risk from an insider standpoint, I think the measuring from an insider standpoint, it's also, you have to come back to Leo's point. What's your target? What is within that particular data you're looking to protect? And what are you defining that as a part of your insider threat program? That's extremely critical. Is it my employees? Is it my vendors? Is it all of the above? How broad a base you want to really go back and cover in the first phase? And then how do you guys have metrics around that? So I think back to his point, data will provide you everything, but there's a river of data right now. Can I really come back and bring it down to a level where I can come back and say, I'm going to measure this, and this is what I need from that particular data. Here's my target audience.
does that start with a canvas of your IT assets, or say, oh, what's on this server? Oh, okay, well, that's valuable. Or does it start with a sort of, here's the business that we're in, here's the data that we know we own and we need to protect, and start there, and then, okay, well, where is that data living right now?
Exactly.
I think there's an interesting, NIST gives you kind of a little framework, which is highly useful, and it's standard in all sort of risk management canon of determining the likelihood and the impact. So you go through that exercise. But the real problem is partly determining what's your risk, what the threat, what the impact is, but then what's your calibration? How much are you willing to, how much sleep do you want to lose? This is an executive decision that isn't calibrated by a tool. And that's really part of the conversation that needs to be occurring in a systematic way. What is our risk tolerance? How much are we willing to put at risk, and for how long? And there's no quantification to that. Somebody mentioned the cloud stuff, the difficulty of moving into the cloud. I think it's a very interesting problem. Go back to the OPM thing. A chain of trust authorization. We have many chains of trust that we're depending on. In a cloud environment, we've got a chain of trust. We don't know who our neighbors are. Maybe you've got a FedRAMP cloud. Who else is in that cloud? What are they doing? How do they manage it? These are things we don't know. So it's very hard to calibrate what our tolerance is until we get more information. I think that's a missing part of the picture, that we got to figure out how to do that so that we can answer the question, how much sleep do we lose, and are we in the right neighborhood?
And in my experience, also organizations, particularly in regulated industries, tend to define risk in terms of their regulator, in terms of auditors and fines.
But even there, like you said, there's a spectrum. I mean, so you lose some PII data and you have to do $25 a month breach notification for X number of people.
Which nobody's going to adopt.
You're in the nuclear industry and you have an audit finding and it can be thousands to millions of dollars per finding. And so these things, even in regulated industries, the spectrum is very big and the cost can be enormous.
Or your Sony Pictures Entertainment, you've got to build your
That's
entire
right.
IT infrastructure from scratch.
Right.
Yes. Okay, I want to throw it to the audience now for some questions, because I'm sure there are some for our panelists. Questions about insider threat, cyber espionage, yes?
I've often found that human resources can be a voice of reason in this. How much should they be talking about to you guys before you deploy your sniffers and stuff going after users and stuff?
I can take a stab at that. So yeah, so HR is a very important part of the whole picture. In fact, human resources is the one where we actually start, because they are the ones who are going to come back and basically help you drive the remediation process. If an employee is doing unintentionally is breaking some kind of a policy, HR needs to be involved, and then you have a step involved where HR says, I'm going to come back and basically have a level 1 escalation within your management team. If you still don't come back and stop doing what you're doing, we're going to come back and escalate to level 2, and then level 3, you're going to go through a training process, and if you still don't do it, then you'll be out of the company. So HR is very, very much involved as a part of the incident response and as a part of the whole remediation process, because, as I said, your bulk of your employees are trying to do the right thing. If they need to go through a training process, they need to get the security awareness in place, HR needs to be involved. So they are heavily involved in this whole process.
There's another aspect to that, too. I think it's a really good point, because identity management, we were talking about the Snowden case and this misuse of credentials. So identity management begins with HR, with onboarding, and then it extends to our ability to do monitoring and to detect anomalous behavior. Really depends on the strength of our reliance on identity. Do we know that that person is who we really think they are? And there's a weakness of the HR. If you look at any typical organization, the HR department has no real stake in maintaining the identity at the IT level, because that's not what they do. They pay you. They pay your insurance payment, or they do your pension, whatever it is. They have no interest, and as long as that money goes to your bank account, that's the end of it for HR. IT is a much more complex identity, because people can have multiple identities that have to be understood and have to be managed as to what their privileges are at any given moment. So this gets into a very complicated question. And the other part of it is to do this monitoring, and it can't be taken lightly. People have rights. And believe me, if they think you're spying on them, and we saw, even as people were horrified by the scope of what Snowden did, on the other hand, there was a huge backlash about people just feeling, hey, we were being spied on. This is not trivial. So it's HR, it's legal, and it's your privacy officers have to be absolutely involved in any strategic discussion you have about an insider threat and monitoring behavior, because it all comes together. And if you get all of that, you can start to, you'll see the weaknesses. And so you try to do that, you're going to find out how weak your identity management actually is inside your organization. And we're finding that out in the federal government as we try to do this. So I think this is another area that takes a lot of attention, and we all got to pay attention to it.
Yes, sir.
Just a couple quick statements. One huge challenge is the cost of the various tools. I've been in information security for almost 30 years, and I can tell you, 7 years ago, 7 years ago, the tools we have in place were not present then, and we need more things. We need more tools like the SIM and their sticker shock. So there is the challenge of selling that to individuals in the organization who are decision makers that are isolated from IT.
Can I make a quick statement to that? I would say it's not the cost of the tool, it's the lack of knowing what the return on the investment is.
I was about to say that there's you got to sell the benefit and the bang for the buck,
Exactly.
and not wait for an incident to make that investment wise. Also, concerning insider threat, there was something happened a couple years ago, and folks, this isn't rocket science or brain surgery, but there was a caseworker in a Texas County Health and Human Services Department who took care of adoptions. She emailed him or herself files from work to home, stored it on a laptop, and I think either the laptop was stolen or the email account was hacked. Now there's 3 tiers that was not followed here. One is education. That's definitely a no-no. Policy, if this is not in the policy, if you're going to discipline that employee and it's not in the policy and you have a union, then that's all for naught. Thirdly is tools. There's a lack of the tools like a DLP in place, and that's something in our agency that we're in the process of deploying now.
Right.
So
there-
it's not
right.
rocket science.
Yep.
So there's the keeping people from doing well-meaning but stupid stuff, and then there's the spotting the people who are doing things that are clearly malicious. And but both obviously can really bite you on the backside if you're not able to do it. Yeah.
That comes up with something you said, the BYOD is it compromises security. So in the long run, is that a penny wise and a pound foolish to have a BYOD policy?
I think what you're seeing right now is a trend going back to enterprise-owned devices. I think it was chicy when the iPhone came out because it was the new gadget, and I think, at least in my experience, was pretty long in mobility. It's coming back to enterprise owned. You can bring your own device, right? You can bring your iPhone in, but you're going to get an Android or a BlackBerry or something like that that's provided by. It's the way of the world. It's what most.
A necklace actually with just.
Your bat belt.
Also so important because if you do put any business data on your personal and anything gets subpoenaed in e-discovery, they take all of your personal because the internet doesn't know if I'm doing personal or if I'm.
Right. There's no segmentation between your personal stuff and your business stuff.
And I know a lot of the NIH people refused to sign that paper because there was no way they were going to expose their personal data.
Right, and we've got millennials coming into our offices, right, whose notion of work identity and work life versus home life and personal life is much more fluid, right? So they're going to want to both be doing social media on the same systems that they're doing their work, and if you can try and put up the wall, but they're going to go around it. So.
Exactly.
And, from the standpoint of someone sort of in the business of telling people no, I don't like to do that, but when I look at that, over time, what I see is that most of what people do on their devices is not sensitive. And it's really sort of frustrating to have to say, well, you can't use that device, because I know that 99% of what they're doing is perfectly harmless and there's no reason to force them to use a controlled, secured device. But differentiating these two things is where it gets difficult. And then again, you have the problem of the person who just does something foolish and doesn't understand or follow the policy. But it's one of the frustrating things when you see that is most of what goes on, it's like 90% of email is garbage, and 90% of what most people do is just chatter. Why do you need to secure it? Why should we spend money doing that?
So I disagree with that because I think that the threat vector is so big in the mobile ecosystem right now that you have the ability to get into the corporate network through your personal device. So if you're attaching your personal device to a corporate entity, that can be hacked and compromised really, really quickly. And sorry, Leo, but that's an area that I really disagree with you on.
What I mean is,
Well, I can
is
disagree
that
with you.
what we're
Great,
doing is
let's do it.
I agree with you 100%. The device itself is an attack vector and is a risk. But what we're doing is we're managing those devices in order to control what most people perceive to be just communication. They're to them, this device is not a vector into the network, and from that standpoint, that's the problem. We put a lot of money into controlling devices when people are not doing anything particularly sensitive.
Rather than being targeted.
Exactly.
Right, because a lot of that communication doesn't go across our network and doesn't have to, but it does.
Okay, guys, we're out of time. Thank my panel. They've been a voice of reason today.
Thank you.
Great information.